I'm in my 30s. That means I've got a risk of death of somewhere in the region of 1 in 1,000 per year. And I like those odds because let's think about what that would mean if that extended for the rest of my life. I'd live into my 1,030s on average. So clearly that isn't what actually happens. And we all know that older people are more likely to die. But just how much really shocks me. So your risk of death as an adult in, basically anywhere in the world doubles every 8 years. It's shockingly universal. It's not just in rich countries. It's like, any period of time or any different part of the world you're looking at, that's about the same doubling time of mortality risk. And that means it's an exponential growth. And we've seen with coronavirus, exponential things can start out very small and they look like nothing's happening and suddenly, boom. So there was a paper that came out in 2015 where scientists took a bunch of mice. They were 24-month-old mice. Now mice, obviously anyone's ever had a mouse as a pet will know, live a lot shorter than human beings do. And they gave them what's called a senolytic drug. This is a drug that's designed to kill the senescent cells but leave the rest of the cells in the body intact. And when you give the mice this drug, they basically get biologically younger.
There's a paradoxical concept of hormesis where a little bit of harm actually does you some good in the long run.
I've even seen some studies that suggest that a little bit of radiation is good for you, because we typically think of radiation as being a really bad thing. It damages our DNA, it causes all kinds of problems. It's one of the, if you get a really big radiation exposure, obviously that can give you radiation sickness, which is terrible. Longer term, it can give you cancer. But maybe the optimal dose of radiation isn't zero. The research is very much still coming in. I'm not suggesting anyone go and sort of get a suntan outside a nuclear power plant or anything like that. But nonetheless, it's clear that sometimes a little bit of something bad can be good for you. This is legit science. There are all these references. This is actually something that's not sci-fi. It's genuinely happening in labs around the world now.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle. This is this isn't the first time we've done longevity and aging research on the pod, actually. I was lucky enough to have Sue Armstrong on, who wrote Borrowed Time. Yeah, brilliant book. She's an incredible journalist in general. We actually end up speaking about Nelson Mandela and how she was one of the first journalists to see him leave the prison, and her book is awesome. And also, I'm gonna mess up his surname, Richard Farragher, is it?
Farragher, yeah.
Farragher. So he hasn't been on the pod yet, but he lectured at my nutritional medicine masters at University of Surrey a couple of years ago, and he's like the most charismatic lecturer you can.
He's so quotable. Like he's got strong views, but he's very quotable.
Very strong views.
I watched him on I think it was the House of Lords Select Committee inquiry on aging. And there's this line where he's like, the way that you're approaching this inquiry is just all wrong, because you're all about like assistive living at home, and like you're trying to give old people like apps to help them when they've got dementia. And this is like getting I can't remember, like the British Motors Company in the 1960s when we were on the verge of developing a polio vaccine, getting them to develop a load of iron lungs. And I was like, that is such a good analogy with all this like ridiculous assistive living app based. Let's try and help people with dementia a bit, where we could be curing them of even getting it in the first place.
Yeah,
so, he's solid.
He's brilliant. He's really cool. And David Sinclair as well. We had him talking about his research, which is awesome. But I'm very new to all this stuff, right? So I'm just like, lowly GP. I work in NHS, A&E. I love sort of diving into these topics, but I would say my knowledge of this sort of area is minuscule at best. I'm a fruit and vegetable guy. So for you, I'd love to start off chatting about how on earth you got into the official term. Is it biogerontology? Is that correct?
That's what I call it. Yeah, some people call it geroscience, but yeah.
Geroscience. I mean, it's definitely a lot more communicable. Geroscience.
Yeah, maybe I should have gone with that, but it's too late now. The book's in print.
It's too late. That could have been the title of the book. How did you get on it? Because you're a physics guy and computational biology, right?
Yeah, so I ended up, I was at the end of my physics PhD, and what I tell people is that I changed career because of a graph. And that's obviously a bit of a weird thing. I'm very statistically, mathematically driven. I guess that's how you end up doing a physics PhD. Yeah. And this graph is a very simple graph. It's a graph of your likelihood of dying depending on how old you are. So I'm in my 30s. That means I've got a risk of death of somewhere in the region of 1 in 1,000 per year. And I like those odds because let's think about what that would mean if that extended for the rest of my life. I'd live into my 1,030s on average. So clearly that isn't what actually happens. And we all know that older people are more likely to die. But just how much really shocked me. So your risk of death as an adult in, basically anywhere in the world doubles every 8 years. It's shockingly universal. It's not just in rich countries. It's like, any period of time or any different part of the world you're looking at, that's about the same doubling time of mortality risk. And that means it's an exponential growth. And we've seen with coronavirus, exponential things can start out very small and they look like nothing's happening, and suddenly, boom. And it's exactly the same with this risk of death. So, if you get to 65, your risk of death, not making your 66th birthday, is about 1%. Still not too bad. But if you're lucky enough to make it into your 90s, your risk of not making your next birthday is about 1 in 6 every year. So it's sort of life and death at the roll of a dice. Now, you look at that as a human and you think, that is terrifying. I've got this sort of exponential wall of mortality just coming at me. Inevitably, there's nothing I can do about it. But you look at it as a scientist and you think, that's really weird. Why is it that humans go wrong? They get cancer, they get heart disease, they get frail. All these things start going wrong with their bodies at this phenomenally synchronized time, across space, across cultures. And if we could understand that process, which is obviously the aging process, maybe we could intervene in the aging process itself and stop people from getting ill in the first place. So that's what really, really excited me about this stuff. And I started reading, we're going to obviously talk more about this, we do now have ways to do that, to intervene in the aging process. And I just thought, this is something I have to learn more about. Maybe I'm a physicist. I last studied biology officially at GCSE, so I was 16 years old and I stopped studying it. I thought, maybe I'm missing something really fundamental. I'm just a physicist sort of barging into this new field. But after working as a computational biologist for 5 years, I just thought, this is legit. It's really important. And actually, speaking to biologists and speaking to people like you, my wife's a doctor as well. And what I found was that biologists, doctors, they don't know much about this stuff. It's because you don't get taught about it. If you had a geriatrics lecture when you were doing your clinical training, they'd have been telling you about, there's all these social problems with dealing with older people, or they're taking 5 different drugs and you've got to be really careful about whether those drugs are going to interact with each other. All that kind of really practical, important stuff. But nobody ever sat you down and said, this probably isn't going to happen next year, but at some point in your clinical career, you might be prescribing people drugs that can extend their healthy lifespan. And, that's just a paradigm that you have to have in your head. No one ever said that. And that means that people haven't heard of it. Biologists haven't heard of it as well. They've got exactly the same problem. And so I thought, I've just got to, get the word out there and write this book.
Totally, mate. I think certainly when I went to medical school almost 20 years ago now, the sort of creative side of medicine, the creative thinking that is essentially needed when tackling such a complex problem such as aging really wasn't inspired. It really wasn't something that we were enthusiastic about or told or motivated to think about as much. Whereas what you're talking about, it kind of blows my mind, the fact that we've lost the fundamental vision of how we can actually get to the root cause of a number of different conditions. Because when people think of aging, they think of exactly that description you made. They don't really think of, aging as a cause of cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, etc., etc. So if you can get to the root cause of aging, you're actually thinking about improving the health span of people as well as the lifespan, rather than it just being some sort of, narcissistic endeavor to live for 1,000 years.
Exactly, and I think that word health span is just such a useful word, because it encapsulates so clearly what it is we're going for here. Because the fact is, if you are healthy, you will live longer. Because what is it that kills you? It's the cancer, it's the heart disease, it's the dementia that finishes your life ultimately. So if we can prevent those diseases, or just at least push them a little bit back into the future, you are going to live longer. But that's almost as a side effect. Journalists love to ask me about immortality. What's going to happen when people live for 1,000 years? And I'm just like, well, I'm not really that interested in that question. What I'm interested in is, what would happen if we could prevent people from getting cancer for 5 more years or 10 more years? Push that back into the future. Make people stay youthful and not frail for a little bit longer, so they can get around the house, they can play with their grandkids, maybe their great-grandkids, they can carry on with their hobbies, they can carry on enjoying life. So it's much more pragmatic than the sort of crazy... Because I talk in the book about curing aging, right? And I do that to be purposely provocative. But when you say you're going to cure aging, or you want to cure aging to someone, they think, maybe you're some kind of transhumanist, maybe you're sort of, imagining some sci-fi dystopia or something. But actually, I just really see it as something that, I want GPs to be prescribing. I want this just to be an extension of, how we do modern medicine.
Totally. What kind of doctor is your wife?
She's just finished her core medical training, which, as you'll know, means that, she's done a bit of everything, basically. And in the UK, that means she's actually, she's coming on to be a relatively senior doctor, but they still call her a trainee. Yeah,
totally. And is she going to be a med reg? Has she chosen a specialty yet? Or
she hasn't yet. No, she's actually taken a year out. She's doing a bit of medical editing, and
nice.
she's actually been managing a virtual COVID ward. So she's been kind of med-regging, but on the end of the phone, because there are so many COVID patients at the start of the year that they just decided they needed to get some of them out of the hospital, the people who weren't quite so sick. So she's been in charge of that, and it's been a really fascinating process. I actually think, I think one thing that COVID has really done, well, there are two things. Firstly, to talk about my area, is it's really illustrated the importance of aging, because what is the single biggest risk factor for COVID? It's being old. And so if we could treat the aging process, maybe we could be ready for the next pandemic. But to talk 100%. A bit about my wife for a second, I think, it's just really exciting that this COVID has like necessitated virtual care, and it sort of kicked the NHS into gear a bit, into trying to consider, are there conditions that we could treat better at home, in the comfort of people's own homes, rather than necessarily having to drag them and keep them in hospital, which apart from being unpleasant is expensive as well.
A lot of my colleagues would certainly resonate with that. We've certainly accelerated the use of med tech that's always been around, but we just have been, we haven't been motivated to use. And I think some of my GP colleagues absolutely love having virtual consults, because it allows them to sort of strategize their list of 40 odd patients every single day. Some people just really miss the face-to-face, and I think there's going to be a blended approach in the future. But in terms of aging, I think everyone is a lot more sort of cognizant of what can happen when you age and what the risk factors are, as we should have been for many years. But one question I did want to ask you actually is there evidence to suggest that we are aging quicker now? Not to say that our life expectancy is going down, but the degree to how many diseases that we have in older age, is that going up, or is it just a function of us living longer?
It's a really interesting, knotty, difficult question. There was actually a paper that came out a few weeks ago, or maybe a few months ago now, that made the case. So the way it was reported was that aging is unstoppable, I think was the headline. And so the idea was that we're all getting older, the rate at which we're aging isn't changing. But actually that was all they'd really shown. They'd shown that mortality risk doubling time I talked about, the fact that your risk of death doubles every 8 years, has been constant throughout the whole of human history, was basically what they were saying. And nothing that we've done with either changing lifestyles or modern medicine, none of that has increased that doubling time. Because what you'd like is to say, okay, so the reason there's a tortoise on the front cover of my book is that tortoises have this fantastic property. They're called negligibly senescent. And what that means is that they have a risk of death that doesn't vary depending on how old they are. And that's really, really incredible, right? Because people know that tortoises live a long time. The oldest Galapagos tortoise, that tortoise that's on the book cover, was about 175 when she died, which is amazing. But what's more amazing is that she stayed youthful effectively. Although they look wrinkly, they don't have any teeth, they're not exactly the greatest ambassadors for longevity. They stay sprightly, at least as sprightly as a tortoise can be, throughout their adult lives. She was probably running around as fast as she could at the age of 150, the same as she was at the age of 50. And they stay reproductively active. They aren't at any increased risk of disease and so on. Yeah, so what this study showed was that we haven't become more Galapagos tortoise. We haven't had our rate of aging change. However, what you can do is, even though the rate at which our risk of death doubles has stayed constant, what you can do is you can reduce that initial risk. And if you've got a smaller number, it takes more doubling to get it up to be a big number, if you see what I mean. So the idea being that by things like reducing risk of infectious disease, by things like improved lifestyle, by things like making sure we've got exercise, making sure we're eating a good balanced diet, all that kind of thing, and obviously the contribution of modern medicine can't be neglected as well, we've effectively lowered the sort of baseline risk of death. And that means that although it carries on doubling at the same rate as it has throughout human history, that seems to be sort of a fact of our species, by starting at a lower number, we can live longer in good health. And I think the sort of question of whether we're getting more diseases now, I think it is largely the fact that we're living longer that's causing those diseases to become more prominent. There's a huge debate about whether our lifespans have obviously increased. So lifespans have been going up by about 3 months a year for the last 200 years with fantastic consistency in the best country in the world. So what that means, we've effectively doubled what it means to be human. We've gone from a life expectancy of about 40 years old in the mid-1800s to a life expectancy of 80 in a lot of the rich world today. That's really incredible progress. The question is, has health span kept pace with that change? Are we just spending the last 20 years of our lives getting increasingly decrepit? I think the evidence is really, really difficult to tease out on this, because one way you can do it is you can say, how many medical diagnoses do people in the population have? The trouble is we're a lot more aware of diagnoses now. There's a lot more medical care. So, there's an extent to which maybe there's more dementia, because what would have just been sort of written off as, she's getting a bit senile back in the 1950s. Now people are getting a proper diagnosis of dementia. And that means, on the pro side, they're getting the care they need. They're getting the support they need. So that if you just look naively at how many diagnoses people have got, it's very hard to know know what's going on. The other way you can do it is you can ask people, you can ask people like, how's your everyday life? Are you having trouble getting on with tasks at home, etc., etc.? And what you find is that seems to indicate that people are living longer in good health, but it really varies by country. And you just wonder if there might be some national personality stereotypes going on here. You know, maybe people in certain countries are a bit more stoic, and so, you know, they're really suffering, they're in pain, but they just say, oh no, everything's absolutely fine. Whereas other people are a bit more whiny. I'll leave everyone to choose which countries they think these stereotypes apply to at home. But, you know, they might be going, oh, you know, I've got a bit of an ache in my knee, therefore I can't do any of my daily tasks around the house without huge inconvenience. So it's really, really difficult to tease these things out. I think the overall reading of everything that I saw while I was researching the book suggested to me that health span has increased, perhaps not quite at the same rate as lifespan, but it's not like it's not like all we've added to our lives is some horrible 20 years at the end. I think we have genuinely improved both health and lifespan throughout history, but it's a very difficult question, as you can tell from that very long answer.
No. It is a difficult one. I think my sort of my perspective is a bit warped, right? Because I've spent some time on geriatric wards as a junior doctor. I see a lot of patients as a GP who are on, like you said, like multiple different medications, and you just think, what are you doing here? And, you know, unfortunately seeing a lot more dementia patients as well. But on, you know, if you take like a sort of bird's eye view of the trajectory of human life, I think we've definitely made leaps and bounds when it comes to better care and better health in older age. And it's just about like optimizing that as much as possible, considering, you know, the number of people that we now have on the planet. Let's talk about how we actually measure aging, because there are some crude measurements of, like, you know, general health and well-being that we use in clinics. So blood pressure, number of medications, perhaps cognitive functioning, executive functioning, whether you can drive or not, etc. Are there sort of like clinical measures of aging that you think would become available to us as clinicians, such that we can actually measure and intervene where appropriate when people are going past a certain point in life?
I think that's definitely coming down the line. And like, I think we've all got this intuition that, you know, some people seem to age better than others, and some people are biologically older than what it says on their birth certificate. And actually, what my wife calls this the end of bedogram. I'm sure you've performed one of these, where you go and see a new patient and you go, oh gosh, you know, she looks a bit older than it says on her birth certificate. You know, she's not long for this world or whatever. Actually, there's some scientific validity to that idea that patients, not just patients, but people who look older actually are biologically older. So there was this fascinating study done in 2009 where they got a panel of assessors to rate how old they thought someone's face looked, and then they correlated that with their future risk of death and disease. And it turned out that looking older actually corresponded to being biologically older, being at more risk of ill health, being at more risk of death. So clearly, and I mean, this isn't really surprising, because actually when you look at the causes of aging, the sort of biological molecular causes that, you know, cause everything, I should say they cause everything. They cause cancer, they cause heart disease, but they also cause the wrinkles, the grey hair, the sort of cosmetic external factors. So the fact that all of these things are driven by the same processes means, you know, in a way it's unsurprising that your biological age is shown on your face. You know, effectively it's sort of reflecting the wrinkles and grey hair, as it were, on your internal organs, even though obviously that's not exactly how they manifest inside you. Luckily as well, you know, we're not going to be consigned to doing end of bedograms for the rest of time. There are some sort of more hardcore scientific ideas as well. I think one of the most exciting is something called the epigenetic clock.
Yes.
And this is where you can take, you can do it with a blood sample. You can actually do it with a sample of any tissue in the whole body. But I guess, you know, often we go for blood because that's a nice, easy one to get out, rather than grabbing a bit of someone's liver or something. And the idea is that you measure the you measure these things called epigenetic marks. These are sort of like bookmarks and notes all over your DNA. So in the middle of your cell, you've got your DNA, your instruction manual. And every single one of the cells in your body that has DNA has the same instruction manual. And that's sort of crazy if you think about it, because, you know, you've got brain cells, you've got liver cells, you've got lung cells, you've got skin cells, all these cells doing such wildly different functions, but they've got the same instructions at the center. So obviously the body has to have some way of saying, okay, you're a skin cell. What you need is activate these genes that are relevant to being a skin cell, to doing your job at your part in the body. And this is done with these epigenetic marks, these sort of little bookmarks going, you know, don't look at this bit's super important, make lots of this one, etc., etc. And it turns out that by looking at how those bookmarks, those epigenetic marks change with age, you can judge how old someone is incredibly accurately. So you can take a sample from someone's blood, you can measure these epigenetic marks, and you can work out their age to within 3 or 4 years. Now that's not that exciting. We already have a technology that's much better at working out someone's age than within 3 or 4 years, because we can look at their birthday. However, what's more interesting is that if your epigenetic age is greater than your chronological age, so your birth certificate age, then again, you're at more risk of disease, you're at more risk of death than someone who's got a lower epigenetic age. So you can have either what's called an accelerated epigenetic age or a decelerated epigenetic age. And this isn't quite at the point where there's anything much that we can do with that clinically, because if someone's older, quote unquote, than their birthday suggests, the advice you'd give them would basically be the same, get some exercise, blah, blah, blah. But I think as we start to understand more about the aging process, we're going to develop drugs that can target particular facets of the aging process. These biomarkers, as they're called, that tell us how biologically old someone is. They'll tell us if a treatment's working, and they'll tell us, whether someone needs a treatment yet, or and so on and so on. So I think these things are very much, they're in development, and they're not 100 years away from being applied at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And even from like a very crude point of view, if someone had an accelerated aging process, maybe, as a clinician, I could be a bit more proactive with pinging that person to, make sure they're doing exercise, or perhaps even organize health coaching, or have them come into the clinic for more regular tests and that kind of stuff, in anticipation of, there being these wonderful drugs that I'm sure we're going to get on to talk about a little bit later, being prescribable. But before we get into that, why don't we talk about those features of aging? So you mentioned these epigenetic alterations. I thought there were 8 hallmarks of aging, but I must have misread that. In your book, you talk about the 10 hallmarks of aging.
Yeah, I was mixing things up a bit just to keep you on your toes. So there was a paper that came out in 2013, and it was called The Hallmarks of Aging. And there are 9 in that paper. There have also been a few other attempts to categorize the various sort of changes that are related with aging. One has 7, I think one has 5 or 6. There are basically, biologists don't quite agree. And so what I did was I took that 2013 paper, which has 9. I think I combined 2. I added 1. I ended up with 10 somehow.
Gotcha. It's a nice round number. I like it.
Exactly. It was very fortunate. And I mean, one of the things that happened was, in the intervening sort of 7 or 8 years, since that paper was published, the particular thing we've learned a lot more about is the microbiome. So the sort of bacteria, the fungi in your guts, they seem to have an association with the aging process that just wasn't mentioned in that paper. So anyway, I ended up with 10 of these things. I won't go through all of them, to save your poor listeners' ears, but these are the fundamental underlying causes, we think, of the aging process, and they range in scale across our whole body. So I mentioned already DNA, this instruction manual at the center of every one of our cells. That's one of the most changes in that is one of the most fundamental hallmarks. So you can imagine if you get damage to your DNA, or you can get mutations, which are effectively spelling mistakes in that instruction manual. Because of those mistakes, that can then lead to various aspects of the aging process. And the most obvious one, I think, that a lot of people know is related to DNA, is cancer. Because cancer is essentially a disease where you accumulate enough mutations in a cell, and that allows that cell to carry on dividing and dividing, become a tumor, and eventually potentially, take your life. So that's the sort of very small scale. There are then other molecular things like the epigenetics we just mentioned. There are proteins inside your cells that can either change or become damaged, or all kinds of various things as you age. Getting onto a slightly bigger scale, the cells themselves can age. So one thing that I love to talk about is senescent cells. I'm sure we'll get onto that a bit later. And these are effectively aged cells, which we know accumulate as you get older and effectively accelerate aging throughout your body. And then sort of zooming out even further, dysfunction in these sort of smaller scale hallmarks causes dysfunction across the body. And you can get problems with things like signaling, which is the communication between your cells that can happen. As that gets dysregulated, your whole body can sort of fall out of regulation. And then, bigger still, your immune system. And this is, I already mentioned coronavirus. We've really seen how older people's immune systems just aren't as powerful as younger people's ones are when it comes to fighting off infection. So the combination of these various smaller hallmarks causes your immune system to age. And that doesn't just affect infectious disease, actually. Your immune system does a number of other things. Firstly, it seeks and destroys those senescent cells I was talking about. So as it gets less effective, it gets less good at that. So you can see how that sort of forms a vicious cycle. And secondly, your immune system is really important for cancer as well, because it's constantly patrolling, looking for these cells that are on the route to becoming cancerous. And if your immune system gets less effective at that can make cancer more likely too. Yeah. So you can really see, I've just given a sort of flavour there rather than a proper in-depth overview of all 10 of them. But you can see there are a variety of these changes. They're all quite interconnected. But what's surprising is, 10, it sounds like quite a lot. I've just talked for quite a long time about 3 or 4 of them. But actually, if you think about the number of age-related diseases you've got, there are hundreds of kinds of cancer. If you think about the number of ways that your brain can go wrong as you age, there are dozens of types of dementia, all with subtly different features, all happening at subtly different scales in your body. So although there are 10 of these hallmarks, and that might sound like quite a lot, it's actually quite a lot less, and it's quite a lot more fundamental than the sort of diseases that we currently treat in medicine. And that's what really excites me, is that by going after this relative handful of hallmarks, we could potentially address like dozens or even hundreds of age-related diseases.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about senescent cells, because that comes up quite a bit. Let's double click on the actual definition of what a senescent cell is and why those are problematic.
So senescent is just the biological word for getting older, basically. So we talked about negligibly senescent tortoises. So that means tortoises that basically don't age. And these senescent cells are effectively aged cells, right? So they're cells that have they've either got a lot of damage to their DNA or mutations. So we've already mentioned that. And that means your body goes, oh, that cell, it's looking a bit suspicious. It's sort of looking as though it's on the path to cancer. And so what it does is it tells that cell to stop dividing. And you can have a similar effect where a cell is actually just divided too many times. So all the time in your body, in places like your skin or your intestines or your blood, you need to have constant renewal of the cells in those tissues. And what that means is that you've got cells that are constantly dividing to replace the ones that are dying. And that means they divide and divide and divide. And over a lifetime, that can add up to a lot of cell divisions. And again, your body is suspicious of cells that are divided a lot of times, because what divides a lot of times? Well, it's cancer again, isn't it? So if a cell is divided too many times, your body slams on the brakes, turns the cell into this non-dividing senescent state. And when you're young, the good news is your immune system comes over, gobbles up these cells. There's a sort of constant rate of production. There's a constant rate of them being gobbled up by the immune system, and everything's basically fine. But as you get older, you've got an increased risk of getting these senescent cells. And that's because you've had more time for you to accumulate the damage, the mutations in your DNA. You've had more time for your cells to divide more often. So there are more ways to produce these cells, basically. And then on the other side of the balance, your immune system is getting less good at seeking these cells out. And in fact, ironically, it's partly because some of the cells in the immune system go senescent. They stop functioning as they should. And so you get this vicious circle. The number of cells goes up and up and up in your body. And what's unfortunate is that these senescent cells, they don't just sit there not dividing, not doing their job, but not doing any harm either. What they actually do is they pump out this toxic cocktail of molecules. And actually its primary purpose is to say, hey, immune system, over here, I'm senescent, come and eat me up. But unfortunately, when your immune system fails to do that over time, those molecules can basically accelerate the aging process. And I think the reason that we know most about this is because, that might all sound quite depressing, but actually we've done these experiments where you can remove these senescent cells. So there was a paper that came out in 2015 where scientists took a bunch of mice. They were 24-month-old mice. Now, mice, obviously, anyone's ever had a mouse as a pet will know, live a lot shorter than human beings do. So 24 months old for a mouse is about 70 in human years. These are sort of, late middle-aged mice. And they gave them what's called a senolytic drug. So this is a drug that's designed to kill the senescent cells, but leave the rest of the cells in the body intact. And when you give the mice this drug, they basically get biologically younger. So firstly, they live a bit longer. That's good. But we don't want them just to be living longer in ill health, sort of hobbling along, but somehow prevented from dying. But the good news is that isn't what happens. They get less cancer. They get less heart disease. They get fewer cataracts. So this whole range of age-related diseases is prevented. And it's not just the diseases. They get less frail, so they can run further and faster on a little mousey treadmill, which they use in these experiments. They've got these incredible things. It's such fun reading these mouse experiments, the sort of gym they send them to work out, how their aging is progressing. It's like, how long can they dangle off a rotating rod? Can they walk along a tightrope? All these sort of various little challenges they set them. And by deleting the senescent cells, you make them better at these challenges. They improve cognitively. So if you put an old mouse in a maze, they're often a bit anxious. They're not very exploratory. If you put a young mouse in a maze, they go and check everything out. And if you delete the senescent cells, you sort of restore some of that curiosity in the older mice. Right. And honestly, these mice, quite apart from any of these detailed biological measurements, they just look great. I was a computational biologist, so I didn't deal with mice directly in the lab myself. But even to my wildly untrained eye, the mice that have had the senolytics, they got better fur, they got plumper skin, they just look fantastic. And what that means is these senescent cells are a root cause of this whole swathe of different age-related changes. Not just the lifespan, not just the disease, not just the frailty, not just the wrinkles and grey hair, sort of the lot. And that's really the dream of anti-aging medicine, is that we can go in, we can intervene in one or more of these hallmarks, and we can then prevent a whole swathe of different age-related changes and make people healthier for longer. So that's in mice. But now there are 10 or 20 companies trying to turn that idea from something that works on the bench in mice to something that works in humans. So this is something that could really be happening. I think we're going to see the first senolytic drugs on the market probably within the next few years. And at first it's going to be for specific diseases where senescent cells are known to be a problem. But if those drugs are safe in those trials, then you could potentially start thinking about handing them out to people preventatively. So I really think this is something that's going to happen, certainly within your medical career.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, I know the question that everyone's listening to is probably asking themselves right now is what was in that senolytic drug cocktail.
Yeah, so what they started out with a couple of existing drugs. One called dasatinib, which is a chemotherapy drug,
Oh, okay, yeah.
and something called quercetin, which is actually I think it's a flavanol, so it's a molecule that's found in
Yes.
fruit and veg. And
Yeah.
so the way they did this experiment was really pragmatic. They got basically a dish full of senescent cells and non-senescent cells, and they dripped on a variety of drugs that they thought might help. And they just tried as many as they could, and they found that the most effective combination was this D plus Q. And actually, some people are taking forward D plus Q. You know, that's what one of the companies is trying to look into whether that's going to work. But other companies, that's just sort of a first draft. It's just some stuff they happen to have in the cupboard, basically. So they were trying it out because they had it to hand. But now we understand how important senescent cells are. People are going out and trying to develop new compounds that are going to be more effective. So they're going to target those senescent cells better, kill more of them with fewer potential side effects. So it's just going to be a question of sort of watching and waiting and see which of the approaches is the most successful.
I guess when people think of that, they might be thinking, this is amazing, we can get rid of senescent cells, and with this cocktail of drugs, obviously there are side effects associated with chemotherapy, but let's say we can better target specific senescent cells. What are the potential side effects that we should be worried about when using hypothetical senolytics?
It's a really good question, and I think it's a very wise question medically to ask this, because we know that all drugs have side effects. There's just nothing you can give someone that will make them better with absolutely no consequences. I'm sure, as anyone who's read the side of a pill packet knows, these senolytics are definitely going to cause nausea and headaches, because that's just what literally everything causes. What's sort of fascinating and amazing is that in these studies in mice, there don't seem to be any negative side effects, in that they seem to affect everything in a positive way. Now, I think we should take this with a grain of salt for two reasons. The first is that when you're a scientist trying to get your big splashy scientific paper, you don't report every last single niggle and quibble that happened. You report the good results. So there's that sort of bias in there. And the second thing is, and this sounds stupid, but mice can't talk, which means if there are, any headaches or nausea, for example, they can't squeak to the experimenters that they're having a problem. So there are various places we might expect this could be an issue. Because although senescent cells are bad in a lot of parts of the body, let's take an example of the brain. One of your neurons in your brain cells could turn senescent. It might be that although that neuron is senescent, although it's not ideal that it's in that senescent state, it might be part of a memory, or it might be part of some function that your brain is performing. And what we'd rather do with a senescent cell in one of these really important situations is turn back the clock and reverse whatever problem caused it to become senescent, rather than just deleting it.
Yeah.
At the moment, we don't know about those side effects. In fact, I think there are even some trials of senolytics to improve people's dementia. So it's really, we're just going to have to watch and wait, basically.
Yeah.
But it's definitely worth being mindful. These things aren't ready for the prime time. I'm certainly not running down to my clinic trying to grab myself some D plus Q, trying to blag myself some from the pharmacist. Because I think we just got to. The trials are happening now, so we're going to know the answers soon enough that we don't need to be sort of jumping the gun and trying these things out.
Yeah, going back, it's come to mind now, going back to your description of how exponentially we age after the age of 50 or 60, and looking at all the different hallmarks of aging, you can understand that exponential increase, because if your microbiome is affected, your telomeres are affected, your immune system is affected, those things are all interrelated. So if they're consistently getting worse across the board, and that's going to be leading to a whole suite of inflammation issues, increased cancer issues, increased memory problems, dementia. You can sort of understand that if those are all the hallmarks of aging, if they're universally getting reduced, then you're going to have this massive uptick in number of diseases that leads to death.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's just such a beautiful, simple way of thinking about it. And actually, there are a lot of mathematicians who try and model the body in really, really simple ways, just to sort of see what will happen. And there's this branch of mathematics called reliability theory, and that's used to predict the reliability of everything from steam engines and components in factories. And people have even applied it to biology. And what they find is that if you just consider the human body as a bunch of abstract interacting systems, and we won't specify what's inside the black box, but they're just these interacting systems, because of the way that they interact, you end up with this exponential increase. Because as things go wrong, they cause these vicious circles. This thing goes wrong, it makes this thing worse, and then that thing getting worse makes the first thing worse again, and round and round and round you go. So the human body, it's basically just a machine that spirals out of control toward the end of life. I think that's exactly the right way to think about it.
Yeah, right. I'm going to pepper a whole bunch of terms to you, and feel free to define them as you go along, and just talk about how it's sort of related to the hallmarks of aging and what might be on the future. Because your book goes into great depth, and it's really it's written in a way that is accessible, and I think that's one of the things that I want to make sure people listening to this, understand, because it's one of those books that I think everyone should have, because everyone should really be thinking about aging in a sort of more of a positive light rather than something that is inevitable. Autophagy. This is a term that gets bandied around quite a bit, and I believe it's related to senescent cells as well. What is autophagy, and are there mechanisms to try and upregulate this, or drugs on the horizon, or even lifestyle practices that we could do to change that?
Autophagy is so fascinating. So autophagy means self-eating, and it's the process by which your cells recycle components inside themselves. And the way that this process works is it seems to preferentially recycle the old and the broken components inside the cell, and then break them down and make fresh new ones. And the way this was first observed is by looking at organisms that are doing something called dietary restriction. So this is where you radically cut back the amount they eat. And what you find is that when you cut back the amount that they eat, if you imagine you're a cell and there's no protein, there's no nutrition coming in, you're going to have to make do with what you've got. And so what they do is they ramp up this process of autophagy. And as I said, it preferentially breaks down the things that are broken already. And what that then means is that we think it's breaking down some of those broken proteins. It's effectively slowing down aging, because one of the things that causes aging is the accumulation of these broken components inside cells. Whereas if you're eating a plentiful diet, you're scoffing loads of food, you've got all this fresh protein coming, like why bother recycling that stuff when you've got a load of fresh new material that you can use to manufacture your various components inside the cell? So the idea is that by reducing the amount you eat, or perhaps by fasting, you can activate this autophagy process. Now, the question is, is this something that we can all try at home? And the answer is it's frustratingly unclear. And I found this like one of the most annoying parts of the book to write, because you're just reading all of these studies about diet. And you're just like, I know if I just read one more study, I'm going to find the answer. I'm going to find like diet nirvana, where I know exactly what to eat, how much to eat, when to eat it. This dietary restriction phenomenon, it's one of the most universal in biology. It works in single-celled yeasts. That's the fungus that's used for baking bread and brewing beer. It works in nematode worms, which are these tiny little millimeter-long worms that are often used in aging research. It works in fruit flies, which are, again, classic biology organism. It works in mice. It works in dogs. It works in, it's just so many animals that we've tried it in. And yet, whether or not it works in humans is still uncertain. And it's so frustrating. The closest we've tried it in is monkeys. And so there was this 30-year-long experiment that started in the late 80s, looking at these rhesus monkeys and giving, half of them were calorie restricted and half of them weren't. And it definitely improved their health span, but the lifespan results are ambiguous. And the real challenge with this, we've also got a bit of human data as well, but these human trials, they're just too short. Because imagine how long this study would have to be to find out if it improves someone's aging. Ideally, you'd start someone on dietary restriction at, age 30 and watch them for 40 years, and longer if it works. It's genuinely problematic. And what you find is that these short-term studies, they seem to demonstrate that markers of health are improved. So your cholesterol goes down, your fasting glucose, these sort of blood sugar goes down. These things are improved, and the big but is there are side effects, as with all medication, as we were just discussing. So people, firstly, they report the hunger never goes away. They're just like hungry all the time. So that's something that I would find very hard to deal with personally. And then there's the sort of more medical side effects. We know that there's a risk of your bones getting thinner if you stay on this kind of diet. There's a risk of anemia. So there are a handful of people in the trial had to drop out because they noticed that the levels of iron in their blood were getting too low. What was the other thing I was? Oh yeah, there's a risk of decreased immune function. So again, there's sort of no point potentially theoretically living 5 years longer if you're just going to catch the flu and die because your immune system's been weakened by dietary restriction. So it's really hard to know whether we should recommend people go away and fast or dietary restrict. I'm not even the right kind of doctor to be making these recommendations. I've got a physics PhD, as we discussed. I really can't feel happy with myself going out and making this kind of advice. What we need, I think, more importantly than that, firstly, is to make sure we don't eat too much. That's definitely bad for us. No, that's absolutely unambiguous. And secondly, we need to develop drugs that can activate this process of autophagy without us having to do this sort of exhausting, bone-thinning, blood-thinning fasting process. And so what's really exciting is there are some drugs in the pipeline that are hopefully going to go in there, activate this process of autophagy in our cells, and, as I say, without the sort of the burden of having to fast in order to manage it.
Yeah, one of the things, because I get asked about this quite a bit with, whether people should fast or not, as it's become so trendy these days as a weight loss tool primarily, but, there might be some other benefits, is we don't know what the correct dose of fasting is appropriate for which person. And fasting itself is just so vague. You know, what is it? Is it 5-2? Is it sub 500? Is it water fasting for 3 days? Like, there's so many variables involved in the process of fasting that it's very hard to cater for. And like you said, that, you know, we don't have like a singular marker that is a correlation with better aging or less aging. So it's hard to design like the perfect experiment to even test it out. And I know there's a group, I think they're colloquially called the cronies, where they've like been like calorie restricted for years and years. I don't know if they're still around or not, but they're sort of like doing their N of 1 experiment, or N of 100, however many there are of them, or whatever. But I'm not too sure about what their health status actually is.
I think it's really surprising. I actually did a bit of Googling about this and was finding out about one of the sort of... So so crony, the reason they're called that is it's calorie restriction with optimal nutrition, CRON, so the cronies. And I was Googling about one of the people who does this. And I can't confirm this because it's internet forum rumours, but he hasn't been seen for a while. And the reason it's supposed to be the case is because he was trying to... So optimal nutrition is the really key part of this, because if you cut back on the number of calories you eat, you're inevitably going to cut back on all the micronutrients you get as well. And so he had like tried to optimize his diet based in the absolute, you know, approaching it pretty scientifically, I have to say. You know, these people, they aren't messing about. They're really like trying to optimize their diet in every possible way. But it's thought that he got an iodine overdose from trying to add seaweed to his diet to increase his iodine levels, and that damaged his vocal cords. And whether or not that story is true, I think it's just so illustrative of how hard this is. Because these are, you know, I think they're pretty smart people. They're honestly trying to do this in the best possible way, and yet getting all the right vitamins, you're not being deficient in something, but equally not overdosing in something at the same time. It's just such a fine line to walk. And exactly like you say, you know, when you talk about fasting, there are just so many protocols. There are some people who are like, I literally don't eat for a week and I do it every 3 months. And then at the other extreme, there's this sort of 16-8 time restricted feeding, it's called, where you say, okay, I'll only eat for 8 hours a day, then I fast for 16 hours. And there are just, you know, some people, you know, do 12-12. So it's like, is that not just normal eating? Like, that's not just so wildly different from someone just eating normally. So what I normally say is that I think we're going to have cured aging like medically before we fully understand all the variables of diet, because, you know, amount of protein, amount of carbs, different nutrients, when you eat, like there's just so much you can change in all of that. You know, there are so many variables. I just don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom of it, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think there's so many arguments as well that sort of like make it even more difficult for the average person to understand who they should be listening to, what they should be putting in practice. Sustainability of diets is a key thing, and sustainability of a fasting practice, I think, is another thing. I think if we could design a perfect experiment that didn't require, you know, following up people for tens of years, it would be to find a decent biological marker of aging that everyone agreed on, almost like a credit score that was sort of a contribution of all those different hallmarks of aging, put them on different regimes, have a washout period, and maybe, you know, do the different regime, and then, you know, see what effect that had. But like you said, there's so many different variables, you know, someone's microbiota status, their genomics, life experiences, all these different things. It's very, very difficult.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, because when I talk about these biomarkers like the epigenetic age, and that sounds quite dry and scientific, and we need to develop some biomarkers. But that, you know, actually the reason that's super important is exactly as you say. Like, we don't want to do a 40-year-long trial for an an anti-aging drug, because quite apart from anything else, I'm going to be pretty old by the time that 40-year-long trial is completed, and then they'll be like, yeah, it worked, and I'll be like, damn, I didn't take any of it. I've sort of blown my opportunity. And obviously, I'm talking about that in a slightly selfish way, but that applies to billions of people. What we really need is to be able to, you know, measure a bunch of people's biological age, give them a treatment, then they come back 6 months later and we go, oh, your biological age has gone down, or maybe it hasn't gone down. Therefore, the treatment does or doesn't work. And that's why these biomarkers are so important, because although they sound sort of dry and nerdy, they're the thing that's going to enable us to develop these treatments like literally decades faster than doing the experiments in the sort of quote unquote conventional way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at the moment we just have sort of like adjuncts as to what is a marker of aging at the moment. You mentioned glucose control that goes haywire after a certain age. That's why we see so many people with type 2 diabetes in clinic and stuff, and we start on them metformin. Even though actually metformin is potentially an anti-aging drug as well. Have you looked into that yourself?
Yeah, metformin is super interesting. And actually, there was supposed to be a trial started on this already, but I think it's been delayed due to COVID. I think it's now going to start this year in the US.
Okay.
And the trial is called TAME, Targeting Aging with Metformin. Now, as I'm sure you will know far better than me, metformin is like this absolutely rock-solid classic drug. We've been prescribing it in the UK since the 1950s. It's one of the most widely prescribed drugs, and it's a drug that's normally given to people with, like you say, type 2 diabetes, so people who can't control their blood sugar, without the assistance of the drug. But what people have found is they've looked back at medical records and noticed that people with type 2 diabetes who are taking metformin actually live longer than people in the control group of the experiment who aren't taking metformin. And the reason they aren't taking metformin is they haven't got diabetes. Now, what's really counterintuitive about that is that people who haven't got diabetes, they tend to be less overweight, they tend to have less heart problems, they tend to just be healthier in general than diabetics. And yet if you give a diabetic metformin, they seem to live longer. Now, the problem with this kind of study is because it's what's called observational, there can be all kinds of other things going on. So maybe the reason the diabetics live longer isn't because metformin is some wonder drug. It's because the fact that they're diabetic means they're coming and seeing someone like you, every few months. They're checking in with their GP, they're having their blood sugar, they're having their cholesterol measured all the time. Problems are getting picked up early. Whereas, the classic man, I'm going to gender bias this, they're in their 60s, they might have high blood pressure, they might have a bunch of things wrong with them, but because they haven't got a diagnosis like diabetes, they're not getting the checkups, they're not being seen. So maybe the reason that the diabetics live longer is just because they have more contact with doctors and problems are getting picked up early. So what we really need to do, this TAME trial that I talked about, it's what's called a randomized trial. So they're going to get a bunch of people, I think between the ages of 60 and 80. They're going to split them into two groups. They're going to give one group metformin. They're going to give one group a placebo, so effectively a sugar pill that doesn't do anything. And they're going to watch them over sort of 3 to 5 years. And they're going to see if they get one of a panel of age-related diseases, so cancer, heart disease, various other things. And also, of course, whether or not they die. And if the people in the metformin group get those diseases later and die later, then what you can say is metformin isn't just a diabetes drug. It's one that affects the whole aging process. So that's something that's really interesting to watch. And the reason that's particularly interesting isn't because we think metformin's going to double your lifespan or something, because I think the expectations even of the scientists doing the trial is it's going to be a modest improvement at best. What's cool about this is they've developed this protocol for the trial in really close collaboration with the FDA, who are like the drug
Food and Drug Administration, US.
Yeah, Food and Drug Administration. Yeah. They're the drug regulator is the word I wanted over in the US. And what that means is that therefore this is sort of laying the groundwork for future anti-aging drugs. So things that are more exciting than metformin basically are going to be able to plug into this protocol and say, okay, you now understand that we can... Because one of the big problems at the moment is you can't get a drug approved for treating aging. You have to get a drug approved for treating a particular condition. So, you say, I've got a patient with diabetes, I want to give them X or Y. And you can do this, what's called off-label prescribing, where you give someone a drug that's approved for something else, but there is no way to give someone a drug just because they're old. Like there's nothing wrong, quote unquote, wrong with them.
Right.
They're just old. And so what those scientists were doing wasn't saying metformin's a wonder drug, though obviously I very much hope it is. But, what they're doing is sort of laying the groundwork so that when the wonder drug does come along, there's a way to get it approved and a way for people like you to prescribe it, rather than it just having to sort of languish, on the lab bench when we've got this amazing thing that we could be handing out to people.
Yeah. That would be amazing. And I've heard that the potential mechanism behind metformin is its impact on mitochondria. Is that something that you looked into in terms of the mechanism of why metformin
it's so
might...
messy.
This whole field is super messy.
Doctors talk about like dirty drugs, and metformin is just absolutely filthy, if that's the criterion we're going on. So it definitely affects your mitochondria, which are these powerhouses, the sort of way that your cell generates energy. There's also some evidence that it affects your microbiome. It might be a dietary restriction mimetic, so it might change autophagy by activating something called AMPK. So it's all over the place, and I strongly suspect there are other, and obviously also it has blood sugar control, because that's the whole reason that we use it in the first place. So there's this whole variety of different effects, and it probably intervenes in all of the hallmarks of aging, to be perfectly honest. So this is like this absolutely filthy drug. I don't think we're ever going to nail down exactly what the effect is that causes it to help. But I think most of those effects do seem to be helpful. So it's probably some combination of stuff.
Yeah. I think people in the nutrition world refer to foods as dirty drugs as well, because there's so many different mechanisms by which they might be having an impact on your health and well-being. Whether it be a calorie mimetic, or whether it's having an impact on your microbiota, whether it's having an impact on your signaling pathways or general inflammation. They're so hard to quantify. And on the subject of mitochondria, I've heard of people, I know Professor David Sinclair talks about this quite a bit, of some supplements that impact mitochondrial function, namely, I think it's nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, NAD, and supplements that boost that, NMN. What's your opinion on those?
I think we just don't know. It's really frustrating because it's quite a complicated field. Again, it's all quite messy, but I feel like there's just not the evidence for these things yet. So the idea is that NAD is this molecule that's used for a variety of processes in the cell. It's used by your mitochondria when energy is being generated. It's actually used for DNA repair as well. So if you get this damage to your DNA, it's not a one-way street. You can repair it as well. And NAD plus is really, really important in that. But the drugs that boost it, it's just really not clear what their effect is. So there's something called niacin, which is just a vitamin. So that's often been prescribed by doctors to people with a deficiency, and it seems to lower cholesterol. So it's sometimes used in heart disease. The problem is that's got loads of side effects. It causes, the sort of superficial and unpleasant stuff like skin flushing. So you end up feeling really hot. And it's also just not clear what the overall benefit on your health is. So then people are like, okay, niacin, it's got all these weird side effects. Maybe we can come up with other stuff. So they come up with these other NAD boosters. NMN, just the evidence is just really, really not there in humans. There have been a couple of recent trials that have finally come out in humans, and it was looking at, I think it was a group of 25 older diabetic women. So it was diabetic women over the age of 65. And you and me looking at this as young men, we're thinking this isn't a group that we really fall into. And then, and you've always got to remember this when these clinical trials are done, they're often done in a specific group, and that's the right way to do it. So you can start to, unpick and understand its effects, but it means they don't always generalize to the whole population. Yeah. What they found was that NMN supplementation improved the ability of their muscles to take up glucose, which sounds good. It's going to help potentially with the diabetes. However, there's this absolute laundry list of other things in the paper that they tested on which it had no effect. So actually the sort of more honest title of the paper would be like 101 things NMN supplementation doesn't do to older diabetic women. Oh, and by the way, it improves their blood glucose.
Right.
So I just feel like this thing is so messy. And there was a trial of a different NAD booster in mice. And one of the problems with mouse studies is they're often quite small, and particular labs have particular quirks. There are also different what are called strains of mice. So mice are different genetics, basically. And sometimes the effects vary between these strains. And in the US, there's this thing called the Interventions Testing Program. And this is 3 labs distributed around the country. They do the biggest mouse trials in 3 separate laboratories. So if there is a little weird quirk of one particular laboratory, hopefully it'll get averaged out. And they try giving a whole different range of drugs to these mice, and one of the things they tried was an NAD booster, and it had no effect on the mice lifespan. And of course, it might be the wrong dose. They might want to, you might want to give it at a different point in life to where they gave it to those mice. But I just really feel like the evidence just isn't there. And there are things that I'm so much more excited about, like these senolytics. I'm sort of tempted to, I'm not saying we shouldn't do any research into these things because there is, evidence that it can make a difference. But there are just things that I'm much more excited about than these NAD boosting supplements.
Yeah. Are you excited about any supplements at all that are currently on the market at the moment? Because it's a minefield. I mean, I get asked about all of these all the time, and my general opinion on supplements is, make sure your vitamin D3 is in range. Make sure you're taking a B complex if you're vegan. Unless you have severe what's the word I'm looking for? Deficiencies in certain other micronutrients or minerals, then you shouldn't really be supplementing most of it from your food and focus on your lifestyle. Are there any ones that you think that may hold promise if they don't have human evidence at this point?
Do you know what? I think I'd just reflect your answer straight back at you. What I've been saying when I haven't been doing a podcast with a doctor is that you should talk to your doctor and find out if you have any deficiencies. And then, beyond that, I don't think there's an awful lot that most, healthy people can do to deal with things. I just don't think the evidence is there. And so the reason that I say this is these randomized, not just randomized trials, but massive what are called systematic reviews, which is where scientists have gone through and said, let's take every single trial on a subject and pull it all together and do some clever statistics and work out like the absolute best possible answer. And what you find with most vitamin supplements is they have no effect on your risk of death. And in fact, there are a couple that even very slightly increase your risk of death. So there's just really nothing to recommend these things unless, as we said before, you have a specific deficiency. And actually, I think this all sort of dates back to an early theory of why it is we age, which has now basically been debunked. And that theory was that a lot of it was driven by free radicals, which is something you've probably heard of, or a lot of your listeners have probably heard of. They're they're often what are called reactive oxygen species. So as your mitochondria are generating energy inside the cell, they're dealing with very highly reactive chemicals. And one of those chemicals is obviously the oxygen from the air that we breathe. That's what sort of effectively we're burning our food in this oxygen. And sometimes it can fumble one of those oxygens, and it can create what's called a reactive oxygen species. And this chemical sort of goes around the cell, damaging stuff. It damages proteins, it damages DNA, and it was thought that this damage, as it accumulated throughout your life, was one of the things that caused the aging process. And so if these free radicals are what's causing the problem, maybe what you want to do is take a vitamin C supplement, for example. That's an antioxidant. It'll go in, it sort of slurps up these reactive oxygen species without taking damage itself, and it saves the rest of your cell. However, what we've since discovered is that reactive oxygen species are actually used by your body. And this shouldn't be a surprise, right? Because life has been dealing with this problem literally for billions of years. So the idea that evolution wouldn't have thought of this and like come up with its own internal solution is just a bit crazy, actually, with hindsight. So what we think happens is that I think one of the most exciting uses of reactive oxygen species is that your immune cells can bombard a bacterium with reactive oxygen species to kill it, basically. And they're also used for signaling. They're just used in loads of different functions around the body, because evolution has gone, well, this is created as an inevitable side effect. I'm going to come up with a use for it. And so if you take vitamin C and slightly reduce the number of reactive oxygen species, what your body probably does is it goes, okay, I'm going to produce some more to compensate for the fact that some of them are being removed, or I'm going to reduce my own natural antioxidant production, again, in order to, maintain that balance. And maybe even if you take too much of an antioxidant supplement, it's actively going to cause you harm. So I just think that really simple story, it sounds so obvious that, the food we eat damages our bodies, which goes on to cause our aging. It's such a simple, intuitive sort of tale. And unfortunately, the science has moved on. We've basically shown that doesn't work in the lab. The big trials show that these vitamin supplements don't extend people's lifespans. But nonetheless, vitamins, they sound healthy. So a lot of people just carry on taking them, even though the evidence just isn't there anymore.
Yeah, I remember.
Talking about a study where they gave, I can't remember if they were athletes or they were trained individuals, and they gave them vitamin C after a workout session, and actually it blunted the hypertrophic effect on their muscles, because the inflammation producing effect of exercise is actually something that causes resilience and actually leads to those beneficial outcomes. So if you blunt that inflammation after your exercise, it stands to reason that you're actually blunting the thing that causes the benefits in the long run. So again, it's this kind of this paradoxical concept of hormesis, where a little bit of harm actually does you some good in the long run, that people don't really get their head around. And I think, the convenient explanation of getting rid of all reactive oxygen species, it doesn't really hold true in a lot of circumstances.
I think that's a really great example, and I think that idea of hormesis just crops up again and again. And as long as it's only a little bit of harm, I've even seen some studies that suggest that a little bit of radiation is good for you, because we typically think of radiation as being a really bad thing. It damages our DNA, it causes all kinds of problems. It's one of the, if you get a really big radiation exposure, obviously that can give you radiation sickness, which is terrible. Longer term, it can give you cancer. But maybe the optimal dose of radiation isn't zero. The research is very much still coming in. I'm not suggesting anyone go and sort of get a suntan outside a nuclear power plant or anything like that. But nonetheless, it's clear that sometimes a little bit of something bad can be good for you.
Yeah, that's why I have a little bit of junk food in my diet every week.
Exactly, totally justified by hormesis.
Totally. Let's talk on this subject, actually, because a lot of people who listen to this ask me about cold therapy, as in cold shock therapy. Again, another very sort of trendy thing, whether it impacts brown adipose tissue, whether it impacts your immune system. Is it something that people at an older age should be doing? Is there any evidence for that as a lifestyle hack?
I've not seen anything that's really compelled me.
Okay.
So I don't think we really know the answer. And again, the problem is that the sort of ideal study until we get these biomarkers of aging is going to be to give a bunch of 60-year-olds cold shock therapy for 10 years and see what happens to their overall health. Yeah. I think the thing that we've got a bit more exciting evidence on is the other end of the temperature scale, so hot stuff. And actually saunas are quite an interesting example of this. The trouble is, again, all these studies are what's called observational, i.e. you ask people how often they go to the sauna and have a look at their health, rather than forcing. And there's also sort of the practical and ethical issue of this. Are you going to force people to go to the sauna for 10 years in order to try and get the results for this? But the best studies for saunas come out of Finland. And that's obviously because Finnish sauna culture is a really integral part of their lives. And what they find is that the people who use the sauna more regularly seem to get less cardiovascular disease. Now, it could be because of the heat. It could be because people who are using the sauna a lot just have a lovely, relaxed lifestyle. They've got plenty of time to go down the sauna. It's a very social thing in Finland, so maybe it's just like a de-stress thing. So it's very, very hard to like tease out cause and effect. And the other big problem with this study, which I found really, really funny, is that in Finland they didn't have a control group, because there is nobody who doesn't use the sauna. So they were like comparing people who use the sauna 7 times a week to people who only use it once. And so there wasn't a proper control group. But what they found was, I think it's pretty safe to say it's not bad for your health unless you've got a serious heart condition, basically. And actually the biggest health problem they found associated with taking the sauna was that the single largest cause of burns admissions in Finnish hospitals is people, burning themselves in the sauna. So I just think this is it's basically a wonderful study of Finland as a country, but it also makes me a little bit excited that there might be something in the heat therapy side of things.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
All these different lifestyle hacks don't come out without their hazards, I'm sure. So looking at we talked about Senolytics, and you talk about a whole bunch of other sort of studies in progress in the book as well. What are you most excited about when it comes to the field of aging, and where do you think the science is going to go? I mean, the prospect of me being able to prescribe an anti-aging drug is incredible, but I think there are a number of different hurdles to get there before, like actually defining aging as a disease, for example, something that I don't think I appreciated before this. What are you most excited about going forward?
I'm actually, and this is a funny answer, I'm most excited not by any one thing, but I'm excited by the sheer diversity of approaches we have. And the reason that it sounds like I'm dodging the question. The reason I'm not dodging the question by saying that is because if Senolytics were our one sort of dreamboat, our hope, and if they fail, everything fails, that would be really depressing, because although I am really excited about Senolytics, I think they've got a strong chance. We know from drug development that so many things work fantastically in mice. We've cured cancer in mice hundreds of times, and yet it often doesn't translate into humans. However, what's really cool about this is we've got these 10 hallmarks that I talk about. We've got multiple ideas to treat each hallmark. We've got literally dozens of ways to slow or reverse aging in the lab. And what that means is we've got dozens of bets. And that means that, we're not relying on any single one of them to succeed. We can be hopeful that, some subset of those, say we've got 5 treatments for each hallmark, we've got 50 potential ideas. And if only 10 of those work, that could still vastly increase our lifespan and health span. So we're not betting, we're not putting all our chips on any one particular idea. The other thing that really excites me is that the more of these things we can develop, the longer we can potentially live, and then the longer we can have for more of these treatments to be developed. So there's this sort of virtuous circle in aging for once. So the idea being, imagine you're in middle age now. Imagine you're trying to optimize your lifestyle. You're exercising, you're eating the right food. And obviously you have to get a bit lucky because, various things can conspire even if you have the best possible lifestyle. But you can realistically expect to live, say you're in your 40s, you can definitely expect to live into your 80s, probably even your 90s, if current life expectancy trends continue. Then imagine we're going to know the results from metformin in the next few years. We're going to potentially know the results of Senolytics in the next few years. If you start taking some of those things, you could live a few years longer. And that gives scientists a few more years to develop even more treatments. And so in the book, I talk about stem cell therapy and gene therapy. These are things that, they're definitely not ready for, to be handed out to people who are just old. They're being used for specific conditions where we know that stem cell loss is a problem, or people who have single gene disorders, they're called. So, where they've got a single gene that's wrong and we can go in and fix it, basically. But to use that for aging, you're going to have a much higher bar, because some of these single gene disorders, they're awful and there's nothing we can do to treat them. So obviously you're willing to sort of take a punt on something like gene therapy that isn't necessarily 100% ready for like prime time use yet. But we're really, really accelerating in these ideas. And I think they're decades away rather than centuries. If in 20 years' time gene therapy isn't pretty widespread, I will be shocked. And what that means is that we can start to think about some of these, things that sound a bit more sci-fi. They're going to be ready in time for most people alive today, especially if those people alive today can benefit from some of the early sort of simpler, regular drug type therapies that we're developing. So I'm just really excited by this whole constellation of different treatment ideas we've got, and the fact that every win that we have gives us more time to make the next win.
Yeah, it's such an exciting area, and it's mind-boggling that hasn't been given as much attention, given how many issues we've had as a result of aging. And when I look across the different hallmarks of aging, the 10 different areas, I always have my sort of diet and lifestyle slant on things, right? So when I look at DNA damage or telomere shortening, I'm thinking about, okay, how do you encourage a lifestyle that is least stressful as possible? How do you introduce mindfulness and meditation and reduce woes and worries and all the rest of it? When I look at things like the microbiota, how do we increase the variety of different fibers increased fruit and vegetable consumption, making sure that you're having adequate protein stores to make sure that you have enough of the substrate to make all the different enzymes, etc., etc. When I think of immune function, I think of the same sort of things. There are so many elements in our lifestyle that can have an impact on the hallmarks of aging. How much more as a function of those things on top of like a great lifestyle sort of suite of tools, how much more do you think we'll be able to push lifespan as well as health span with all the different arenas? I know you don't like to put a number on things, but I'm going to challenge you on that.
Yeah, I think it's really, really hard. And the reason is we've not actually obviously tried much of this stuff in humans.
Yeah.
If you look at the mice, these mice that we gave senolytics, we gave them senolytics aged effectively 70 in human years. And the mice that were given the senolytic drugs, I think they lived about 2 months longer than the mice that weren't given the senolytic drugs.
Okay.
That's maybe a few years in human terms, but sometimes effects are a bit bigger in mice than they are in humans. The thing that makes it really, really hard to predict, though, is, say senolytics are going to give us a few years. That's obviously great, especially if those few years are, without the cancer, without the heart disease, preventing all that stuff in good health. But exactly as you said earlier, these things are so tightly interacting. So maybe, by improving by getting rid of some of our senescent cells, we'll improve our immune system, and we'll come up with another treatment that targets, DNA damage, and that'll then have another sort of potentially synergistic effect, i.e. an effect that's greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
And the reason that seems optimistic is that I'm optimistic about that happening. Is there have been experiments in animals where we've made gene changes. So there are lots of genes that we know about in animals where you can change that gene or delete that gene, and it makes the animal live longer. And there are quite a few examples where if you take one longevity gene that adds, say 20% to the lifespan, and another longevity gene that adds 20% to the lifespan, and make both of those alterations, you then add 70% to the lifespan, which is obviously bigger than 20 plus 20, just to, ram home my point nice and clearly. So I'm really optimistic that by combining these treatments, we can potentially have a much bigger effect. And we haven't even tried combining these things in mice yet, so we just don't have any benchmark. And it's just very hard to say, because by changing that mortality risk doubling time, to go a bit nerdy and mathematical for a minute, if you reduce your risk of death by a little bit, the fact is that the doubling time is going to catch up with you, because as we've seen, exponential growth, it starts out small, gets very big very quickly. If you can change that exponential growth, then suddenly goodness knows what we're going to do to lifespan. If we can end up with a risk of death that is only changes by half as much with time, that could have a huge impact. And that's why I just hate putting numbers on these things, not just because I'm a scientist, but because it's really, really hard to predict. And actually, I think my sort of question dodging but exciting answer is this is going to happen in time for most people alive today. The reason being, senolytics are a few years away. Even if we think about stem cell therapy and gene therapy as being decades away, then that's still in the lifetime of most people on the planet now. And then toward the end of the book, I started talking about what are called systems biology models, and this is getting like proper nerdy, where we want to build these massive computer models that integrate and understand all those interactions and show us how the human body, like different parts of those different hallmarks, talk to each other. That's something we're not even close to being able to do now. But can I really say that we won't be close to doing that in 50 years' time? I don't think I can, because if you look back over the last 50 years of biomedical innovation, we've, think about computers, and I looked this up the other day. In 1971, the first 8-inch floppy disk was made commercially available, and yet now, it's just hard to grasp like how much computers have come on in that time. So what's going to happen in the next 50 years? Similarly, we discovered the structure of DNA in the 50s, and yet now we can literally sequence your entire 3 billion letter DNA sequence for less than $1,000, and we can do it in an afternoon. And so what's that going to look like in 50 years' time? So we're going to have so much more data from things like DNA sequencing. We're going to have so much more powerful computers. I think you'd be a fool to bet against these systems biology models being in existence in 5 decades' time. I'm hoping still to be alive in 50 years. I think a lot of people are hoping still to be alive in 50 years. And as I say, especially if you've taken those senolytics, maybe you've had an early gene therapy, something like that. And what that means is you're going to be around to benefit from those systems biology models. And the computers are going to be much, much cleverer than we are at coming up with clever ways to intervene in aging. So that's why I just hate putting numbers on this stuff, because it's so dependent on what could be incredible revolutions in technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all those incremental gains, as small as they might be in each field, will compound over time. And if you're having those incremental gains in different areas of your lifestyle, and then combining that with all these different areas of biogerontology, it could be incredible to see how long people live going forward. And one of the things that I should ask about actually, or I wanted to ask about this at the start, but is the large majority of the listeners are females aged 35 to 50. And I think they'd be very interested in the impact on fertility and actually whether any of these elements have been looked at with regards to prolonging the fertile period. Is that something that we've even begged to ask the question of at this point, or are we quite a long way from that?
I think it's a really neglected area, actually, because the sort of the very basic principle, as I've sort of highlighted, is that all these hallmarks of aging affect the whole body. You know, they affect the wrinkles, they affect the grey hair, they affect the cancer, they affect the frailty. The same biological processes are underpinning all of this stuff. And therefore, you know, it stands to reason that they would also affect the fertile window. However, I just don't think there's been enough research done specifically on that. And it slightly annoys me, and I know that I'm a bloke and I'm speaking out of place here, but I feel like this is a bit of a feminist issue because, you know, the fact is that women do have this biological clock that's, you know, ticking much, much faster than men in terms of having kids. And that impacts on their careers, it impacts on their life, it impacts on all kinds of different things. And I really think that, you know, as we go forward and as lifespans potentially get quite a lot longer, maybe you are going to want to spend a longer time, you know, developing your career or traveling or whatever it is you want to do as a younger person. And then that means that, you know, we need to extend that time for women to, you know, give them equal opportunity. So yeah, I think that this anti-aging stuff is actually a feminist issue as well. But unfortunately, like so many areas of women's medicine, you know, it's just been, I think, largely neglected, and it's something we need to do something about.
Yeah, definitely. I spoke to Lisa Mosconi about this, Dr. Lisa Mosconi, who is an expert in women's health and looks primarily at the brain, but also menopause as well, and estrogen's impact on neuroscience, neurology. And from a personal point of view, you know, I'm 36. A lot of my female friends are similar age, mid-30s. One of my friends is an ENT registrar, so senior registrar, and one of my male friends, same age, is now a consultant because he didn't have to take a couple of years out because he wanted to have children. His wife had children, and you know, he was able to progress through his medical career and become a consultant earlier than my other friend, who's had to take time out. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, she's a massive disadvantage because of that. That was her choice to do. But had the fertile period, if we're able to extend the fertile period until much later on in life, would she have made the same decision? Maybe not. Who knows? And I think, you know, given that we are living in ever, you know, in a world where there is ever increasing opportunity for both genders, this is something that it could definitely have an impact on.
I think it's really important. And actually, one of the things that one of the things I get asked most often when I talk about curing aging, actually, you know, back when I used to go to dinner parties and weddings, and I guess that's going to be safe again. I might actually see some other human beings again soon. But back in those days, you know, when I said I'm writing a book on aging, the first question I normally got was not, you know, how do I extend my lifespan? When are these drugs coming? You know, what can I do, etc., etc. It was, what about overpopulation? Because I think a lot of people just imagine there are loads more people living longer. It's going to put huge strain on the planet. That's a whole podcast in itself. And actually, I think the worries about it are, you know, the point is that actually on the other side of the balance sheet, you've got aging. You've got this thing that causes 2/3 of deaths in the world and causes billions of people to suffer over decades as they gradually deteriorate with these diseases. That's sort of another discussion. The reason I wanted to bring it up is there's this other control on population that we don't often talk about, which is birth rates. And birth rates are going down around the world. And actually, if we extended that fertile window, we know that women are choosing to have children later and later in societies where they've got the option. So actually extending that fertile window could also help with population as well. So it's such a multifaceted thing. I just think it's so shameful that we don't put more research effort into that. And I really hope that's something that's going to change.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. And you know, I think people look at aging research in the same way they might look at, you know, rockets and space technology and think, oh, well, that's just a narcissistic endeavor. Actually, you know, there's a whole bunch of different elements of science that could be repurposed into other arenas, whether it be looking at hunger, whether it be mapping, climate change, whether, you know, all these different applications of that technology. But people like to see it in their sort of narrow window, and I think we need to widen the perspective as it pertains to aging, because you know, it's a massive feminist issue, as well as many more that we haven't had a chance to talk about today.
Yeah, definitely.
Mate, you're a fantastic science communicator, honestly, and your YouTube channel is brilliant, and I can't wait for more videos for you to put on there as well.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's something I'm trying to develop in my massive amounts of free time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, writing books and what's your day to day now? What is it looking like?
Oh, well, so the book came out in the UK at the end of 2020, so in December 2020, and it came out in the US in March of this year, 2021. And it's been a bit of an endless publicity treadmill for that time. So just as the UK was dying down, the US sort of flared up. And, this is, we're finally at a stage where things are starting to peter out a little bit, and I am having a bit of time to do YouTube videos and other stuff.
Nice.
But you don't realize how much stuff there is in the background. So I've just submitted the corrections for the paperback version of the book. There are a few little tweaks I've made because that's coming out at the beginning of next year. So it's just, there's so much stuff. I guess I'm sort of thinking in the back of my mind about the next book, what that's going to be about. I'm trying to do a few more YouTube videos. There's a bit of discussion about a TV thing spin-off from the book, so I'm really hoping that's going to come to something. But it's just incredible. I was a full-time scientist before I started writing, and I got this book deal. And it just so happened I just finished writing a paper. I was coming to the end of what's called the postdoc, so the postdoctoral research that I was doing. And me and my boss just said, basically, you finish one project, you might as well just, quit and do the book full time. And I'm so glad I did, because it took me 2 years full time to write this book. There's so much research involved. There's literally 400 references in the back, and that's only half the papers I read. So it's just absolutely incredible. I think my mistake, if I can be said to have made a mistake, is to choose a subject that touches on literally every aspect of our biology. And I really wanted to get the research solid, because the most important thing I want people to take away from the book isn't necessarily to know every single thing about the nitty-gritty of how the mitochondria or the DNA damage or whatever it is affects aging. I really want, everyone, whether that's, people on the street, whether it's doctors, whether it's biologists, whether it's politicians who are controlling the purse strings for funding of this kind of research, to come away and think, this is legit science. There are all these references. This is actually something that's not sci-fi. It's genuinely happening in labs around the world now. So yeah, that's the reason it took me 2 years full time to write it, because I wanted it to be absolutely solid. And writing a book, it takes a while. Who knew?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if the quality of your YouTube videos is anything to go by, a TV series is going to be awesome, and I think it will definitely absolutely catapult the field of aging research leaps forward. So I hope that happens, and I hope it's on Netflix or something like that.
Me too.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was great. That was fascinating for me as well. But really good.
It's been a real pleasure.
If you enjoyed that video, you will love the library of content that we have on doctorskitchen.com. Make sure you hit subscribe, and we have podcasts in our library on brain health, well-being, supplements, and lots more. Have a wonderful day.